Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss an incredibly spicy revelation in the news. The superinjunction, which was in place to cover the Afghan data breach, was originally ordered to be lifted last year. However, the government successfully appealed the decision, so it remained in place until last week. But before the appeal, a judge had ordered the lifting of the superinjunction last May the 21st. That is one day before Rishi Sunak called the surprise general election. Did Sunak call it because he couldn't know the appeal would be successful and to avoid the scandal breaking before the election? Is this Rishi Sunak's last big scandal? But first, for daily news and politics, please click the subscribe button to stay notified. So, you might have thought we've done with Rishi Sunak now. His scandals are all in the past, no new ones. This is a big one. There's always been a lot of speculation about why Rishi Sunak called the election when he did. If he wanted an election in the first half of last year, then you would put it on the same day as the local elections. That would make more sense. It would have allowed the Tories to retain more councillors if voters didn't feel the need to take out their frustrations on the government in local elections. They could do it in the general election vote instead, right? So Sunak's decision not to hold the election in May was seen as a sure sign he wanted it in autumn. The decision to announce the election on May 22nd certainly came as a shock when it happened, surprising people in the Conservative Party as well as Labour. Could the reason be that Sunak was fearing reporting on the Afghan data leak and deciding that both the leak itself and the subsequent cover-up would be a really bad look for a government already on for a hiding when the election had to be called later that year? Now, it's not certain, of course. There were other possibilities. Two of them I discussed at the time. There was a sense in which Rishi Sunak announcing the election on May 22nd and holding it on July 4th made a certain amount of sense. There was a bit of logic there. Back then, of course, I didn't know about the Afghan scandal. One was the state of the economy. Now, had Sunak called the election for May, he would have had to go to the polls when the latest figures showed we were in recession. But as it was always expected we'd be back into growth for the second quarter of last year, delaying an extra couple of months might have made sense. It wasn't the fastest G7 growth, as the Tories keep trying to claim. The US and Japan had 6 times our growth rate, Canada 4 times as much. It was a little bit higher than other European G7 members, but they hadn't just come out of recession. But nonetheless, the delay may have been based on wanting the figures to show we were no longer in recession. But why did it need to be in July? Why not October, as many people expected, as a lot of Tory MPs wanted? Well, another factor that I mentioned at the time was the Rwanda scheme. Sunak and the Tories claim to this day that over last summer, flights would have taken off and the problem of small boats would no longer exist. This is a nonsense, of course. The Supreme Court, which had previously blocked the plan, had not given the go-ahead based on the latest legislation. And the Rwanda plan itself only allowed for a maximum of 200 asylum seekers a year to be sent to Rwanda. Labour have deported record numbers of asylum claimants since winning power, and we still have a small boats issue. How would the Tories seriously claim that sending 200 of them at random a year to Rwanda is more of a deterrent than just getting claims processed quickly and deporting anyone who can't prove a valid claim? But had the election been held after summer, the lie would have been brutally exposed. Sunak had claimed the flights would take off in June. No, they wouldn't. The entire scheme would be exposed as an expensive sham. We wouldn't know how expensive until Labour's Yvette Cooper got her hands on the records and revealed it to Parliament. So there was a sort of logic to holding the election in early July. It was late enough that the Q2 provisional economic figures would be out and everyone expected that to be back into growth. But early enough to stop the Rwanda flights being exposed. But this latest revelation is very intriguing. So the day before Sunak calls the election, he finds out that a judge has said the superinjunction should end. Of course, an appeal is immediately ordered by the Ministry of Defence, which ultimately succeeds. But Rishi Sunak cannot know that it will succeed. We're heading into summer. Sunak cannot afford for this scandal to break before the election. Not only does it highlight a basic failure to protect highly sensitive data within the Ministry of Defence, but for a party trying to bash immigrants, and asylum seekers in particular, would reveal a government scheme to essentially wave in a lot of asylum seekers with less scrutiny than normal over the process. and attempting to conceal it from the public, absolute gift to the Tories' opponents. It would be devastating. The Tories are already under fire over the revelations now that they are out, and they're facing different attacks by different groups. For most people, it's the failure to protect data, which put many people's lives at risk. That is the major concern. But for others, it is the high cost of the subsequent cover-up, which could potentially have reached as much as £7 billion, according to the Sunday Times, who first reported on it. But is certainly agreed would have ended up clearing £2 billion at least. For the people the Tories were at the time trying to win over to fend off Reform UK, it is the fact that the scheme not only meant accepting more asylum seekers than they are comfortable with, but doing so with less stringent checks and concealing it from the public. I mean, anyone who's following the story, you can see the sort of stuff that Reform UK supporters are coming out with at the moment. That would have hit the Tories before the election. I mean, it's a massive headache for the Tories right now. But imagine the furore had the news broken before the election. I suppose the good news for Sunak is that he wouldn't need to answer quite so many awkward questions about the economy or even the Rwanda scheme. The bad news would be this would have been way, way worse for him. It's very interesting. I mean, not taking anything else into account, knowing how much damage this Afghan scandal has caused the Tories, and therefore knowing how much it would have caused them if it came out before the election while they were still in power, and knowing that Sunak ordered the election the day after a judge said, yeah, I'm lifting this injunction, be a hell of a coincidence if the two events were not linked. But if Sunak did call the election when he did because he panicked about the Afghan scandal, does that imply he was cool with the idea of letting everyone see his Rwanda scheme an epic failure? Did he somehow think maybe he would go into the election on a platform of attacking the courts and promising to clip their wings, MAGA style or something? It raises a lot of questions. At the time Sunak called the election, Tory MPs were deeply unhappy. They thought that the economic news might be better after summer. So they clearly weren't concerned that the Rwanda plan would be exposed. I, at the time, said I thought they were mad. And aside from the most senior ministers, Conservative MPs would not have known anything about this hidden scandal. It's a remarkable revelation. Opens up a whole new can of worms about why Sunak called the election earlier than most Tory MPs wanted him to. And this will also reflect on the current Tory leadership. Kemi Badenoch, for example, was a cabinet minister at the time. Now, she wouldn't have had any say in the matter. There was nothing she could have done. But she would have known that the election was being timed to conceal a scandal of their own making from the public. Same with Robert Jenrick. Same with James Cleverly if he ever returns to frontline politics. If the Tories think they can beat Reform UK by competing on an anti-asylum platform, I would already suggest that they were failing to do so, just like Labour. More so, in fact. Labour at least have a record to defend on dealing with asylum after just 1 year. Not that it's impressing those who will be satisfied with nothing less than 0 refugees. But the combination of the scandal itself, with the strong suspicion that Sunak called the election just to stop voters finding out about it, could properly finish them off with these voters. Their best bet now might well be to become a pro-EU party and compete with the Lib Dems. But let me know what you think in the comments below. For more content, you could subscribe to the channel or even join for access to streams and behind-the-scenes updates. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.